Georg had been sleeping inside the beer hall for weeks. Not during business hours, but after. After the last Steins were cleared, after the doors were locked, and the room went quiet in a way it never did during the day. That was when he worked, slowly, carefully, carving into stone and carrying the debris out one suitcase at a time, careful not to leave anything behind that someone might notice in the morning. Georg wasn't a soldier or a politician. He wasn't part of a resistance cell, and he wasn't backed by a foreign government. He was a carpenter, a clockmaker, someone trained to understand weight and structure, timing, precision, how long something takes, and how exact it has to be. And he had decided that Adolf Hitler had to die. Not someday, not eventually, soon. That decision led him to a job at an armaments factory near Munich and to a beer hall called the Bürgerbräukeller, the place where Hitler returned every year to give the same speech on the same night in the same room. By the fall of 1938, Georg knew the building better than almost anyone inside it. He knew where people stood, where sound carried, and which pillar no one ever really looked at. And on the night of November 8th, he left Munich believing he had done exactly what he set out to do, but history would remember that night for a very different reason. You're listening to True Crime Culinary. I'm your host, Leah Jack. Let's sink our teeth into this story. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary. I am so excited to be recording this just 8 days before I go on my honeymoon. I am going to Africa. We are going to the countries of Egypt and Kenya. Am I going on safari? Absolutely. It is my Super Bowl. It's my favorite thing in the world. I spent time living in Namibia and have had the privilege of spending a lot of time with animals. And so it's kind of my favorite thing ever, and I can't wait to go. The other thing I'm excited about is now that some of my friends know that I am doing this podcast, they are starting to ask questions about foods they've wondered about as well. Foods and things that foods come in. This week, we're going to talk about Steins. And I'm so excited because, one, I didn't know the history behind it, and two, I didn't know this very interesting story about Hitler, despite being German and being, well, I was raised in the States, but being exposed to the German curriculum. I don't remember the story in particular, but I was really interested to read about it, and so can't wait to share it with you now. But first, let's talk about why people drank beer in the first place. For most of European history, beer wasn't primarily recreational, it was practical. Water was risky. Rivers carried waste. Wells were easily contaminated. People didn't understand bacteria, but they understood patterns, and certain water made you sick. Beer, on the other hand, was boiled during brewing, and fermentation added alcohol and acidity that slowed spoilage. Even weak, quote-unquote, small beer was safer than raw water. So people drank beer daily, including children, not to get drunk, but to stay alive. Beer was hydration, calories, and insurance. And that made the vessel matter. The word Stein comes from Steinzeug, or stoneware. Dense, high-fired clay, non-porous, less able to absorb liquid, smells, or bacteria. Before glass was cheap and reliable, stoneware was technology. In medieval Central Europe, many people drank from wood, leather, or horn. Those materials were light, but they absorbed moisture, they cracked, and they rotted. Stoneware was heavier, but it was cleaner, more durable, and more trustworthy. Choosing a Stein was choosing reliability. Now, when we look at a Stein, we think about, why is there a lid? The hinged lid wasn't decoration. In the 14th and 15th centuries, waves of plague reshaped daily life across Europe. People didn't know about germs, and in fact, germ theory wouldn't arrive until the 19th century, but they did understand filth, decay, and that insects were dangerous. Therefore, cities passed ordinances requiring drinking vessels to be covered, because flies mattered, and air mattered, and smell mattered, and I've always wondered what it smelled like at that time. Like, not enough to really want to stick my nose in it, but okay. So there's some awareness and there's some like, hey, maybe we should cut that a little bit. Public health entered the tavern long before science could explain why. The hinged pewter lid kept insects out and allowed one-handed drinking in crowded halls. Thumb levers made them easy to use. Over time, the mechanism became standardized, and then it became personal. By the 16th and 17th centuries, steins were no longer containers. Instead, they were records. Master potters and regional workshops began producing steins with elaborate relief scenes, images meant to be read while you drank. They included guild trades, biblical stories, local folklore, military units, and political alliances. Allegiances? Either way. Some steins were salt glazed in the Rhineland. Side note, I keep having to re-record sections because I start pronouncing them in German and then I'm like, wait, that sounds so, it's like croissant. Anyway, Rhineland. Others were painted, molded, or etched. Certain workshops became known for specific styles, motifs, and regions. A stein could tell you where someone was from, what they did for work, and who they stood for. In beer halls, steins were communal, but also deeply personal. Some were kept behind the bar and reserved. Some were locked away and brought out only on holidays or anniversaries. They marked belonging. When we think of their weight, stoneware steins are heavy for a reason. Thick walls kept the beer cool, wide bases prevented tipping, and a full liter stein can weigh several pounds. That made them durable, but it also made them dangerous. Court records from the 18th and 19th centuries describe steins used in tavern fights, skull fractures, internal bleeding, and deaths that came days later. Some beer halls quietly banned stoneware during festivals, others switched to lighter materials. The stein at the intersection of comfort and threat. Now, sidebar also, wouldn't it be just so awful that you're like, oh my God, I have the worst hangover, and then you're like, I think I might die from this hangover, and then you're like, yeah, I kind of did. Back to the Bürgerbräukeller, it was filled with steins because steins belonged there. They slowed drinking, they encouraged sitting, they made gatherings linger. Beer halls were designed for staying, not passing through. That's why they worked for politics and propaganda, and that's why one carpenter could exploit their rhythm. A stein is heavy because it's meant to stay put. A beer hall is dangerous because people do the same. So what about our friend Georg? The Bürgerbräukeller was symbolic long before it was dangerous. In 1923, it was the place where Hitler first tried and failed to overthrow Munich's local government and declare the city the center of a new Nazi regime. The coup collapsed, but the movement didn't. Instead, it learned. Sound familiar, anybody? And so every year after that failure, Hitler returned to the same spot, to the same date, the same hall, and the same podium. Beer halls weren't just places to drink in early 20th century Germany. They were civic spaces, political spaces, and places where people gathered to eat, argue, listen, and belong. Steins were raised, beer was sloshed across long wooden tables, speeches echoed off stone walls, and plans were hatched in plain sight. And Georg noticed the predictability. So in the fall of 1938, Georg waited until around 10:30 each night. That was when the beer hall finally emptied. By flashlight, covered with a handkerchief to dull the glow, he dug into a stone pillar directly behind the speaker's podium. He worked for weeks, hollowing it out bit by bit. The explosives came from his job. The mess went out with him every morning, tucked neatly into his suitcase. I read that he worked until 2 or 3 in the morning and then slept until 6:30, packed everything in his suitcase, and then left. And the bombs or the actual explosives he had pinched from work. By the time November 8th arrived, the bomb was sealed inside the pillar. The timing mechanism, a clockwork device Georg built and tested himself, was set. He knew the routine by heart. Hitler would arrive at 8 p.m., he would speak for about 90 minutes, the bomb would go off just before the end. On the night of the speech, Georg boarded a train out of Munich, convinced it would finally be over. He believed Germany would be spared, that workers would regain dignity, that God would reward him for what he'd done. But the next morning, Georg woke to the news that made his stomach drop. Hitler had left early, just 13 minutes before the explosion. Instead, 8 people were killed, dozens were injured, and the hall was torn apart, but Hitler survived. Georg Elser was arrested that same night near the Swiss border. He would be imprisoned without trial and executed at Dachau in April 1945, just weeks before liberation. So, the next time you see a beer stein sitting on a shelf, tucked behind a bar, or lifted for a toast, don't just see a souvenir. Notice the weight of it, the lid, the way it's meant to stay in one place. Steins were built for rooms where people lingered, where ideas were shared, where belonging was reinforced, sometimes for good and sometimes for harm. The Steins held beer meant to nourish, and they've sat on tables where history turned. And sometimes, if you look closely enough, they're not just decoration, they're witnesses. Thanks for listening to another episode of True Crime Culinary. I hope you enjoyed that riveting story. I genuinely didn't know that about Hitler and how different things would have gone had Georg been successful. Hey, if you have any stories that you want me to look into or any foods you have questions about, don't hesitate to email me at truecrimeculinary, all one word, @gmail.com. Until then, see you next week. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.